Governor John Carney's had a busy first 6 months in office, and so we thank you, Governor, for your time being our first person. You described the budget passed on July 2nd as a mix of cuts and revenue increases, but then also called it a missed opportunity. What did you mean by that?
So I spent most of the first 6 months touring the state, talking to Delawareans about the budget imbalance that we had, but nearly a $400 million deficit. And what I heard from Delawareans was that they wanted a balanced approach, they wanted a fair approach, and they wanted a mix of spending cuts and new revenue. And that's what we presented to the General Assembly. In order so that we don't have this come back year in and year out, where we've got this significant budget deficit, we needed to rebalance our revenue that supports a more reasonable budget, and that's what we presented. We didn't get everything. We made significant cuts on the spending side, some of which were painful, cuts that I'd prefer not to do. Mm-hmm. But in the spirit of a balanced approach, and by the way, we weren't able to get all the revenue, which at the end of the day is what I meant when I said it was a mixed opportunity. Because what I heard from people across our state was they were willing to pay a little bit more, mm-hmm. as long as on the government side we tried to use taxpayer revenue money as efficiently as possible, mm-hmm. and address some of the real cost drivers, particularly health care in Medicaid and among state employees and retirees.
Are you going to, now this didn't fly this time around, but will you try to raise personal income taxes next year?
So we'll see what happens. Obviously there weren't the votes for that to happen this mm-hmm. year, and the legislature chose instead to increase a real estate transfer tax. Mm-hmm. Right now 3% is the real estate transfer tax. They increased that to 1% at the state level. Some of that goes to the county and city governments. I still think a personal income tax, modest change there is appropriate in the long term, but we'll see as we get into the next fiscal year what the expenses look like. And we know what the drivers are going to be. It's going to be the same thing, health care and Medicaid and state employees and retirees. It's going to be additional students in education, more students being classified as special needs students, which are more costly. And other personal costs that are increasing. We got some new spending to address some of the corrections prison issues that we've had, which will come back next year as well. So going into next year, I always approach the next budget without the expectation of new revenue and trying to balance the budget that way, and that's the way we'll approach this next year.
Representative Andrea Bennett of Dover essentially killed the tax hike. Have you spoken to her now after the fact?
No, I haven't had time to speak to many of the individuals, and I don't look at it so much as an individual legislator thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, we were not able to convince enough members on both sides of the aisle in both chambers to embrace the package that we had. Again, I thought it was the most responsible, most balanced approach that we could, which would address more in the long term the balance between revenue and expenses. We still made a commitment, and we'll follow through on that commitment to be more efficient. We have a group that meets regularly of agency heads and school district personnel. We committed to look at consolidating school districts. We have a major effort going on right now across not just public sector, but healthcare generally, to drive the cost down. And if we can do that as a system statewide, then that'll positively affect our state budget as well.
The co-chairs of the Joint Finance Committee, JFC, Melanie George Smith and Harris McDowell, they said the state's already looking at a $50 million budget gap next spring. By your estimates, is that
so? That's in the ballpark, right? And that assumes cost drivers, which are additional students coming to school, some estimate about what healthcare cost inflation is going to be, some contractual obligations that are built into your budget for your employees, and it'll be something in that. But that compares to $400 million deficit this year. Yeah. So it's a much better situation. Obviously, that's why I said that it was a missed opportunity. If the legislature had passed our revenue package, we wouldn't be looking at a $50 million deficit. Now, some people would argue that always being a little bit behind makes you sharpen your pencil a little bit better. I think people have to recognize that right now they can't afford the government that they're demanding, right? The services that they are, and so we've got to help. And that's why I did the 20 public town hall meetings, to get a sense as to what people wanted. People didn't want some of the education cuts that were in that budget, frankly. And but at the same time, they say they don't want to pay for it. Well, you can't have it both ways.
Right.
And so that's the educational process that as governor, it's my responsibility to keep working on, and I will continue to do that.
Are you going to keep those town hall forums going?
Yeah, I think we're going to switch a little bit to some of the to business development, jobs issues, and that's frankly what I talked about a lot at the outset of our budget meetings, because the best way to solve a structural deficit is to have your economy grow faster. And so all the decisions that we made in the preparation for our budget was through that lens. Is this going to help us make our state more competitive, to draw and attract talented people and businesses to our state? This tax increase, is that going to negatively affect our ability to attract businesses? And so now I'm going to go out and have town hall meetings talking about, to small business leaders primarily initially, what are the kinds of things that are getting in the way of their success? Because small businesses are really driving job growth in our economy.
Okay, thank you so much, Governor John Carney. Thank you for your time. This interview is online in its entirety on newsworks.org/first.